Hi there, Marcus here again. Futures 202, week 3. And this week I'm looking at the futures senses of memory. And I'm going to basically take you on a kind of almost an intellectual autobiography of this, at least this dimension of what makes me curious about the world around me and past, presents and futures that we inhabit. It's been very interesting for me pulling this together. I keep finding stuff. So it's actually quite a wordy kind of presentation, this one. You might want to pause it at some point and walk away and grab a coffee or lie down and go, oh my God, or just bear with it and let it wash over you. My thinking is that this one is the sort of the thinking behind the future's sense of memory. And the next lecture for next week will be us taking tools and applying them to the future's sense of memory. And I have a tool list, some suggestions at the end of this particular lecture, which I will touch on just briefly now, and we'll have a look at how some of those tools can be applied to the future's sense of memory for next week. And I'm going to do that for all of the future senses, I think. I think it'll work better that way. You know, me doing a deep reflection on that particular sense, and then the kind of tools that we can apply in our workshops, in sort of practical hands-on contexts, where of course the future senses really come into their own. So bear with me on that one, and let's get moving. So I'm going to jump now to the PowerPoint, which is got, you know, it's fun because look at that, isn't that amazing? And there's a method to my madness as to why I've got this gorgeous sort of mixed image of various fungi at work. And it's because one of the first things I reflect on is an article written by a lady who writes for the journal Orion, apart from other journals, and Orion is focused on culture and nature, and she's talking about her fears around foraging and eating wild foods. And she's got a good reason to have fear, because she nearly died from eating mandrake when she was in Sicily. So we'll come to that in a moment. So the thing about memory, of course, is that we can get fixated or caught in memory, and of course, particularly in regards to trauma, and that we remember painful events differently and differentially to the remembering of happy events and so on. So what do I want to say? Well, first of all, I want to quote one of my heroes, FUT202. He was a Chinese-American geographer, fantastic guy, really wonderful writer, died just recently. And he says, look, the senses under the aegis and direction of the mind give us a world. Not the world, but a world. Because all our senses, each one of us, our senses, even our sense of sight, sound, taste, smell, hearing, are differentially distributed. Some people have stronger olfactory sense. They really remember everything through smell. Others have it through visual or sound, tastes and so on. If I taste a certain flavour like marzipan, it whisks me right back to when I was about 12 or 13, because I had an interesting, somewhat experience with marzipan, and so it will do that to me. So he's saying the senses give us a world, and his focus is on the physical senses. He's very interested in human aesthetic, appreciation, and he writes beautifully about the world. He writes about aesthetics and so on. But he's one of my go-tos for especially, I guess, the hands-on applied way that we can engage senses in sense making. So going from there, because also we talked about it last week on intuition, I argued back in 2015 in a short article I wrote for a special issue on intuition that was focused on the work of Oliver Markley, a very senior and well-respected futurist. I made this following point, that intuition is a cultural resource and that when practiced rigorously, researchers gain access to rational, and this is important, rational processes that extend the sense-making possibilities denied us via a narrow empiricism. In other words, a narrow empiricism that basically is built on our 5 physical senses. Can we see it? Can we measure it? Can we smell it? Can we taste it? That sort of thing. Whereas, you know, I'm arguing for future senses as cultural senses. And I link them quite closely to intuition. And I go on to say that intuition is a form of intimate knowing. And to me, intimate futures, the way we embody our futures, and so on, and the way we experience other people's futures too, are all sensorially embedded in our bodies. This is a message that I was giving you last week especially. So I go on to say it offers, that means intuition, a sense of embedded being in contact with the subtle elements of the world. It opens the mind to relational possibilities that were previously denied to it by cultural conditioning. And I'm interested in this relational stuff, the fact that we are embedded in a world and that our senses are not free to function independently of the world, that our senses, the sense of smell and sight, as well as the sense of memory and foresight and voice, you know, these senses are all conditioned by our world, but that we do have the capacity to critically engage those conditioned responses. And one of the chief works or key works of a futurist or a foresight practitioner is to enable people to get a little distance from their conditioning so that they can actually identify it. Because when we can identify how we've been impacted by a certain cultural way of understanding or reading or sense-making the world, then we are in a stronger position to be able to do something about it, rethink or reconfigure, or I might say hack that conditioned response. So this brings me to wave finding. And this is a beautiful image of a Roman road, the Apennine Way, in Italy. So look, Maura O'Connor, in her wonderful book Wayfinding, talks about memory scapes. She's very interested in the neurobiology of wayfinding, of finding our way around the planet and around our backyards. So she gives us this memory scapes, which I think is a lovely image. And she makes this following point. Wayfinding is an activity that confronts us with the marvelous fact of being in the world. And that's exactly what FUT202 is talking about. We're requiring us to look up and take notice, to cognitively and emotionally interact with our surroundings, whether we are in the wilderness or a city, even calling us to renew our species' love affair with freedom, exploration, and place. She's talking about wayfinding in terms of, you know, finding our way around the physical world. But I think we also have a love of freedom, exploration, and place when it comes to our cultures and the culture's potential that are at our fingertips but are often overlooked, again through cultural conditioning. She sums this up a few light pages before that previous quote by saying, in the simplest way of terms, wayfinding is the use and organization of sensory information from the environment to guide us. And I would say that that sensory information can be cultural sensory information, such as the future's sense of memory. That's where we're going. So then, what about wayfinding in a different sense? Well, Sonja Blingnot is a wonderful South African futurist. So she's a bit shy of that term, she's told me, and I'm not surprised because I'm shy of the term as well. I don't really see myself as a futurist per se. I'm more a culturalist, or perhaps I'm a wayfinder. So Sonja talks about ways finding, and I'm going to be interviewing Sonja hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So you'll be able to listen to her talk about ways finding the way she sees it. But this is a snip from her website here. Okay, and it says, you and I are ways finders, she says. Eventually we all come to the edge of our maps. I love that. This is our frontier. the line between what we think is possible and what we are about to discover. Here, the ways-finding invitation is to step into a generative conversation with the unknown, sensing, responding, expanding to meet life as it unfolds. I think that's a beautiful image, and of course it's supported by the beautiful image of the boat on a very, very still water. But to me, it's, if I want to go back to one word there, I love this idea of the frontier, because it evokes to me that horizon line, the horizon line beyond which we can guess or intuit, but we cannot know. It's uncertain, it's open, it's also creative, okay? But of course, in cultures which are always, and at one level or another, about control, it's also a threat. It causes anxiety. We do not know what to do with that, okay? So let's move on to the mushrooms on the front of this PowerPoint slides deck that I'm using. So Erica Berry talks about intuitive eating on poison, pleasure, and trust. It's a great article. You can see down the bottom here, there's a link to her, to the article, and as there is a link up the top there to Sonia's website. So Erica says the following: in our foraging accident, if I'm misreading that, our foraging accident had taught me anything, it was the precariousness of this equation of life, the balance between life and death. She'd accidentally eaten mandrake when she was in Sicily with a couple of her friends, and they all very nearly died. It terrified her. So our bodies demand food for survival, so that we all need that, but sometimes that food could harm us too, just like the mandrake did to her. If I once associated wild food with joyful nourishment, going out and was having an adventure and finding food in the forest that you can eat, now, for her, a part of me would always correlate them with anxious terror. That's the trauma that gets locked in our bodies and remembered at a cellular level and at an adrenal or emotional level. So, and what then, she asks? I could either avoid the thing forever, or, as my father would say, buck up, do my homework, say a prayer, go out anyway. And that's really interesting, because her article is all about going out and learning about foraging, learning about the fungi that grow in the North American forests around Oregon and so on. And it's a very interesting folded article, that one. It's very autobiographical, very much telling the story of how she got poisoned and almost died, and then about the way she manages her fear by facing it and working on generating other memories around the original memory that sort of stopped her in her tracks. So to me, that's really interesting, because memory does that. Memory holds us locked down if we're not careful. So I recommend that paper to you just because it's a really great read. And it's all about her experience of a certain kind of memory. So here we are. Let's map memory. So there are a number of the authors that I look at. They all have different adjectives to describe memory. It's not just memory. For Van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, he says rational and emotional memory are what are at work, and what he's looking at. The rational memory remembers things in a cognitive sense. So you might remember, the square root of something. Let's say 49. Oh, the square root. Oh, that's 7, right? But emotional memory, that's totally different. That's Carrie remembering her bad experience with mandrake, and that holds her almost in a kind of static stance of terror, and she has to work through that. So that's the emotional. For Tennant, she describes episodic and semantic memory. Okay, episodic, that's kind of like the rational, really, and the semantic, that's a cultural reference point. So episodic is what you've learnt in school, or you might remember about your childhood days and so on. But the semantic memory is drawing on the broader cultural memory. So that's another kind of understanding of memory. And then if we go to good old Nora, he's describing a number of memories. He covers them in his beautiful paper. There's archival memory. That's a memory that, you put things away and you can pull them out. And our memory bank in our head works just like an archive or the bookshelf where you keep all your notes. But there's duty memory. That's the memory that we're taught at school about national days and national events and so on. And it's also duty memory in terms of family relationships and so on. There's distance memory. That's almost the semi-mythic memory. Of long ago there was this or that. It's also the kind of memory that appears in narratives about place, so it could be indigenous oral memory as well. And there's explicative memory, which is a memory that explains. I draw on both Tennant and Nora in the slides that come, you'll meet some of these terms again. So let's keep moving. But I wanted to give you a sense that, there's no one angle to approach memory. It's like most things that human beings start to play around and poke with, it's complex. Okay, and that makes it interesting, but it also means that when we start thinking about the future sense of memory, we need to think about ways in which we can tap in and perhaps hack or draw on or also filter out certain kinds of memory that allow other forms of memory perhaps to become more active. So we're locked in time and we need memory. Carlo Rovelli is a wonderful writer, and he makes this, and I think it's a beautifully written point here, so I'm just going to read it to you. We are not a collection of independent processes in successive moments. Every moment of our existence is linked to a peculiar triple thread to our past, the most recent and the most distant by memory. The triple thread of past, present, future. Okay? Our present swarms with traces of our past. We are histories of ourselves, narratives. Note he makes it plural. We are histories of ourselves. And there's the symbol that I use regularly, or the pattern design. It's tattooed on my arm just in case I forget it, where it's pasts, presents, and futures. And that was used in a book chapter that I wrote probably around 10 years ago, or I wrote longer than that. It came out 10 years ago. And it's on my experience in Singapore. We'll touch on that chapter in what comes, but not next. Let's move on. So then, we've got this kind of folded memory, present, past, present, future. So we're stalking the wild epistemic engine. That's a line from this old paper from Churchland and Churchland, husband and wife team, where they say the conglomeration, which is the human brain, standardly evolves an awesomely complex world representation. Okay? In short order, it does it quickly. And on the basis of scanty input. We often come up with, rather broad conclusions about things based on very little evidence or data. The world representation evolves, and it evolves not only during the lifetime of our one single human brain, but across the lifespans of collections of brains. In other words, culture. So how do we make sense of this? Their paper's called Stalking the Wild Epistemic Engine, and they're trying to make sense of how the human brain works and the role of memory in managing that complex world around us. Now, if we're going to look, I'll just flick back for a moment. So we've got this conglomeration that is what we draw upon. We're surrounded by really complex, vibrant, shape-shifting things that we think are stable. And, we call it culture. But no, it's very alive, very dynamic. And it's all rooted in tradition. Tequila, okay, in a beautiful little book about the power of ritual, makes this point. Tradition, though of course always old, is at the same time always new, because it is forever being born again into a new generation and a new historical context. And this brings me to the work that I was doing quite a while ago on heritage futures, where I talk about as you can see down here in the bolded part, creative traditionalism and cultural citizenship. So for me, then, this being born again into new generations is important, because tradition is not static, it's not given. If you think about a great tradition like the traditions of Buddhism or Christianity, Islam, they've been reinvented again and again as they meet each generation with successive issues and problems that reconfigure how we might draw upon, let's say, the Buddhist philosophy. So now we've got sort of socially informed Buddhism that is looking at ways in which the Buddhist thinking and Buddhists can serve the world. Christians have the same thing with liberation theology and so on. Interesting. So traditions are living. They are not just in the past. So that's my argument around heritage futures, which take heritage as the starting place for explorations in identity and agency. It's concerned with how we memorialize and experience, participate in and enact heritage in the present. Furthermore, it takes heritage as a vehicle for enhancing identity, activating agency at both the individual and the social levels in order to facilitate richer futures. Thus, the notions of creative traditionalism and cultural citizenship are used to generate process understandings. Okay, process understandings, not static understandings where you have a definition and it's not allowed to change, of heritage, and to link these with the futures of communities. So, I explain both then. So, creative traditionalism signifies the creative possibilities inherent to a community's relationship to the past. In other words, their memory, right? As I see it, creative traditionalism affirms the role that tradition plays in the present without being limited by or to it. Okay, I'll say it affirms the role that tradition plays. Tradition's important, whether it's Christmas or Eid in Islam or, Holi in Hinduism. Doesn't matter. Those traditions are important, but there are broader traditions to do with relationships, gender, and so on. So, tradition is taken as dynamic, open, and creative, and has an important role to play in communities' cultural futures, how we evolve as collectives, okay? And that's where, if we start drawing on tradition and saying, and I mentioned, let's say, liberation theology, that's where Christian theologians have gone and looked at the Bible and looked at Christian philosophy, for instance, and made a very strong argument for that critiques capitalism, extreme individualism, and so on, seeking to empower the poor, and so on. And so that's where you go back to the original teaching and say, what would Jesus do? Or what would Muhammad do? Or Moses do? Or Buddha? Or whoever? And that's a really interesting question. It's the sort of question that revolutionized Christianity hundreds of years ago when Francis of Assisi asked the same questions and came up with his own solutions that were appropriate to that time in which he lived. So what about cultural citizenship? Well, here are two statements from me. To be a cultural citizen means to belong at a deep level to a range of community narratives, not just one, memories, not just one, and past, not just one, that can include the nation, but is not confined to it or defined by it. I mention the nation there because citizenship is often seen within a political discourse that privileges the nation state, okay? But no, it's not about that. It's about broader cultures, cultures that really inform our identity way beyond what passport you carry, okay? In another paper a bit later, I wrote, essentially, culture tells us who we are. You've heard me say this before, haven't you? I know. You're going, oh, I've got a sense of deja vu. Simultaneously, it limits our horizons whilst offering us escape routes. To be a cultural citizen is to have the critical capacity, that's important. Remember I talked about critique in Lecture 2, to loosen the bonds of culture upon our choices and imaginations, and to be, as Foucault would put it, a little less governed by the politics of cultural conditioning. To be less governed is to be more free, yet freedom is a burden as it brings with it choice. So this is cultural citizenship. It's an important concept because if we feel that we are citizens of a culture as opposed to a nation state, we actually recognize, hey, I've got voting rights. I can make choices in my culture. I can choose to be a cultural being that I can feel good about. And of course, our practices are never independent. They're always culturally situated, which means they're always forming and playing out within collectives. Take a breath. Okay, so with culture and creative traditionalism, we are, or I am, that's probably a better way of putting it, I am pointing towards the fact that we have greater levels of agency and choice. Okay, that's the sense of voice. And that's the sense of voice when we get greater levels of agency, when we actually understand we can work with our traditions, work with our memories, both at an individual but also at a cultural, social level, then we can generate a richer, more informed approach to foresight. Our sense of foresight itself becomes much more dynamic, much more rigorous and vigorous. Okay, so we're creating patterns then. And this is where I come to ritual, because to me, ritual is the foundation of civilization. It joins many minds into one. It weaves threads of regenerative reciprocity with our relationship to our natural environment, our communities, and into our presence. Okay? It is a kind of storytelling, a micro-tale, with the ability to create transcendental meaning. Rituals have the added power to hold space for uncomfortable and difficult emotions, helping to eliminate fear and give reflection. Okay, so here, this is a group of people working with myself and a number of others on developing a ritual, practicing a ritual for responsible futuring. Okay, it's a ritual that involves the body and movement and music, and the bodies come together to form this beautiful mandala type pattern of people lying on the ground and so on. Now, I'm coming to ritual because some of what I'm talking about here to do with tradition and so on is linked to traditional practices that we no longer actually really engage in, practices in which the body is engaged in possibly playful, but always somehow meaningful and life-affirming processes and practices. I'm thinking of, let's say, a Christian service where we sing hymns together, and we, there's periods throughout the, let's say, the Christian service where you kneel or you stand, you turn and you hug one another, and peace be with you, and all that sort of stuff. These are little rituals, but they're rituals that are often contained within a very specific setting. But we can have other rituals and different ways of what I would call patterning. Okay, and this brings us to that thinking I was giving you before about the role of, let's say, prayer and so on. And I'm going to come to that because I want to talk in a little bit about praise song. So this is a quote from that book, The Power of Ritual. Okay, no surprise, is it? Really? But, and I forgot to put the page number in, which is a mortal sin, I have to say, but that's okay. You'll cope. And if you really wanted the page number, I'll find it for you. But it won't be too hard. But let's move on. So rituals bring us into the world, into life, and into community. They're key elements there. And this helps us be a little bit more conscious of who we are and what's going on. So Nora, whom I've referred to before above, talking about different kinds of memory, this is where we look a little bit closer at what he's got to say. The remnants of experience still lived in the warmth of tradition. I like that, the warmth of tradition, that fuzzy feeling good. We feel good at Christmas and Easter and other times like that, and so on. So this is in the silence of custom. You don't need wordy stuff for custom and tradition because we all know it, we share it. In the repetition of the ancestral, again, ritual and repetition, So I'll start that again from the beginning because I'm spending too much time unpacking the sentence. The remnants of experience still lived in the warmth of tradition, in the silence of custom, in the repetition of ancestral, have been displaced under the pressure of a fundamentally historical sensibility. The historical is where the past is externalized in the sense that we become observers of the past. I know that in 1792 this happened. I know that in 1815 this happened. In 1945 the Second World War ended, and so on. But that's not memory in the deeper sense of what we're talking about here, cultural memories, memories that are embodied in us. So he makes this point. Self-consciousness emerges under the sign of that which has already happened, okay, as the fulfillment of something always already begun. We speak so much of memory because there is so little of it left, because the self-consciousness that he's talking about doesn't happen because we have developed a good historical general knowledge, but because if we get it, it's because we can actually draw upon the warmth of tradition and the silence of custom and so on, but bring it into the world today. But when we have little memory left, he would argue, we are politically bereft. We cannot act with strong and clear intention in a world that has been depoliticized. So let's keep moving. He continues. He says, memory is life, born by living societies founded in its name. It remains in permanent evolution, open to the dialectic of remembering and forgetting. That's interesting. Unconscious of its successive deformations. These fossils are like that. Vulnerable to manipulation and appropriation, susceptible to being long dormant and periodically revived. This is so interesting to me because that's exactly what memory is. It's life, and we keep rediscovering memory. We keep touching on elements of it that suddenly reveal themselves to us. Think about it. Society is founded in its name. My memory immediately goes to the Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar, the first of the Caesars, or the first emperors of Rome. During his reign, a great poet called Virgil wrote a memory poem about the mythical history of the ancestors of Rome, that Rome was, founded on, refugees from Troy and so on. It's very, very interesting. Societies, ancient societies particularly, all had their myths that they went back to. And, this was a process in permanent evolution. The Greeks had given us the Iliad and the Odyssey, whereas Virgil gave us the Aeneid. He took an element, a thread from the Iliad particularly, and he re-remembered it or reconfigured it in a way that gave it political legitimizing force within the period of his own writing. I think that's so interesting, but I won't be any more geekish than that. But what's the antithesis of memory? Well, it's forgetting. So we have many kinds of forgetting. I'll put this little paper up for you to have a look at because he explains them all. Repressive erasure is a form of forgetting. That's where, politically we are, in a sense, instructed to forget. Certain forms of memory are delegitimized. There's prescriptive erasure. That's where we all agree on forgetting something. Let's say the Cambodians, after the horrible period with Pol Pot, all the Cambodians seem to have put aside the memory of that trauma. Of course, it's still there within the country and very deep, but it's not talked about. Whereas, in South Africa, for instance, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was designed to lance the boil of this kind of forgetfulness. Forgetting and a new identity. We're a new identity. We are new Cambodians. We're not going to focus on the pain of the past. There's structural amnesia where certain forms of the past are deleted almost. Records can be lost, but more appropriately you might say that this kind of forgetfulness is associated with the way that societal structures in the present privilege certain forms of knowing and remembering over others, which get delegitimized and forgotten about. Forgetting is annulment. Okay, that's where we actually, in a sense, deny what happened in some way or other. Forgetting is a planned obsolescence. That's where things that was in the past, we don't do that anymore. So it goes on to the side. It's just that was past and over and done with. Or forgetting is a humiliated form of silence, okay, where the memory of let's say, a persecuted group is just pushed to the side because, again, we're living in a different world now. Paul Connaughton explains all of these rather beautifully and quite simply. There's a page or two on each one, not even a page sometimes, but I think it's worth knowing that just as we can have memory maps, we can also have forgetting maps. And I think it's, so I brought that in just as a kind of antidote to what I'm talking about, but also because when you're dealing with in workshops with different groups of people, you're going to be dealing with different forms of erasure or forgetfulness. Now, going back to this ritual stuff, there's some beautiful work by Cynthia Dillard, and I put up a really bad scan of her work, which my library very kindly went and got for me. I was thinking it was going to be good, and then I discovered that it's really difficult to read, so I'm going to have to rescan it. But in that particular chapter, Cynthia Dillard is talking about her experience of a return to Ghana, where she was ethnically originated from. She's an African-American scholar. And she talks about memory, linking it to praise song and identity. I think that's rather a beautiful way of thinking about the sense of memory, the future sense of memory. And she makes this point. Here's the pertinent question for those who teach and research. How might our memories, our encounters, and the representations of our memories act as praise songs in the world? I've got an example for you in a moment about this praise song stuff. As we teach, conduct research, and examine and create texts, our sense of who we are, our identity, our very souls and spirits are seen, understood, recognized, and grounded in our past. Well, where else would they be grounded? We might express them in the future, but the roots of all our identities are grounded in the past, folded into the present, and projected into the future. Now, if we understand that identity and the kind of memory work we're doing can be thought of as praise songs, something magic might happen. Let's see what happens with this next slide. So this is from another article which I read recently out of another Orion edition. Again, there's the link there. Have a listen to this. The first sound in the universe is joylessly overwhelming. White noise boring through the taffy stretch of nascent space. The Big Bang is not a bang, but a droning robotic purr. Galaxies expand from the hot throat of a cat. Things cool. Atoms whirl into being. Then light scattering in the cosmic fog. Gas clumps to form the first stars, whose huddled masses in turn form the first galaxies. A storm of gas and dust collapses, perhaps T-boned by a nearby supernova, skidding and spinning into a sun, our sun. All of this cacophony, the universe ringing like a cosmic bell, would be brutal for anyone around to hear it. But there is no one, not yet. That's the way this woman, Imbala, I can't think of her first name right now, captures she's actually reflecting on sound in nature, particularly the sound of the cricket. And, at one level, and this is true of this statement, you get associations like the Buddhist koan is, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Or do you hear the tree fall in the forest when there are no human beings around? Does it actually make a sound? Or is perhaps the sound understood, as that's a tree falling, as just a sound in nature? This is, to me, a praise song. When I first read it, I was really struck by its beauty. And then when I was pulling this all together, this lecture, I was thinking about Dillard, and I was thinking, oh, the praise song. And then, I thought, this is a really lovely example of a praise song of memory. This is memory that's not my personal memory or yours. It's not even social or cultural memory. It's memory as story given to us through science and empirical understanding of the Big Bang and the origin of the universe, but it's given to us in beautiful prose. There's almost a poetry going on here, I think. And that's something about praise songs. So when we do memory work, one of the ways of, I think, activating powerful memory work is to make it into something like a praise song. A praise song involves beauty, it involves a kind of metaphorical richness and a tenderness, and it's not afraid of saying things we don't want to know. There's a very long example that Dillard gives us in her chapter, but it was way too long to quote. But you can go and read it. It's from an African praise singer talking about culture and identity, and the struggles and violences that go with it. So keep moving. We're getting there. You're doing well. So Alex Tennant is somebody else. Alexis Tennant is somebody else that I was talking about earlier on with her different kinds of memory. And I want to return to this, the episodic and the semantic. You could say that the episodic, or you will say, is that it's memory that's personal. As she says, while episodic memory is considered the predominant foundational material for futures thinking, familiarity with the future event in question impacts the involvement of semantic memory, which she, in brackets, describes as general knowledge. So the episodic is my personal biographical memory and experience, the data set from my own life. And then that data set is augmented or expanded through semantic memory, which is the memory that we inherit from the world around us. Memories about the First and Second World War, or about colonization, what happened to your great-great-grandparent or your grandma, or perhaps even closer to home, your mother and father, and so on. When research participants are asked to construct future events that are familiar to them, they rely on material from similar events from their past. That's the episodic memory. But when they attempt to construct future events that are very different from what they know, they tend to draw more from their general knowledge, semantic memory. It's a bit like me just referencing before the poem The Aeneid by Virgil, and he himself, drawing on semantic memory, was then in turn referencing the Iliad. And of course I can reference the Iliad and the Aeneid because I'm living after Virgil and therefore have the privilege of hindsight. Alexis continues, the ability to draw upon both types of memory appears to further expand the limits of how far into the future we can imagine, with the farthest projections of the future pulling from the semantic memory when necessary. So as we seek to understand and perhaps engage the future sense of memory in a conscious way, we need to understand that we have different pools of, you might say, data or information that we can draw upon. And that's where the episodic and the semantic come in. Her paper, of course, is sitting in the collection of papers that accompany this lecture. So, heading towards the end here, and Nora again, talking about explicative memory, that memory that explains or makes sense of something. History's procurement. And remember, he's quite critical of history in the sense that it destroys a certain kind of intimate memory. History's procurement in the last century of a scientific method has only intensified the effort to establish critically a true memory. Every great historical revision has sought to enlarge the basis for collective memory. So historical revisions means the rethinking of, the Napoleonic era, the French Revolution, the First or the Second World War, or the 20th century in total. We're seeking to explain things. That's historical memory is used to make sense of the past in a way that is palatable, intelligible, or sometimes also challenging to the present. But that's not the kind of memory that the future sense is about. It lacks the intimacy. Knowing that your great-granddaddy died at the Battle of the Somme in the First World War is quite different from knowing the statistics about the First World War or knowing how it started. One is quite abstract, the other is quite intimate. And that's really something I think we need to pay attention to as we move forward. So one of the last papers I'm going to touch on is a paper that in French is Lieu de Mémoire, which is the sites of memory. Let's say like the killing fields in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge. These are fundamentally remains, the ultimate embodiments of memorial consciousness, which is another kind of memory, that has barely survived in historical age, that calls out for memory because it has abandoned it. Okay, so the last remnants, it's kind of like the physical material remnants of historical or past events that have become sites now. Okay, they make their appearance by virtue of the de-ritualization of our world. See, there's a lot of people that I'm referring to here who talk about the fact that we, in a sense, the world has lost its magic and that it has become a data set that we can manipulate. We can talk about the millions of people that were killed by the Khmer Rouge. There are statistics, there are memorials to it, there are museums and so on. It's all rather gruesome and horrible. But at the same time, there's another kind of memory that's being suppressed, okay? And, and it's suppressed because it's become matter of fact, it's become factized or factoided, it becomes data, as opposed to that kind of memory that lodges deep in our bones and that will inform different kinds of foresight work. So, keep on going. So moving from the de-ritualization, he says, producing, manifesting, establishing, constructing, decreeing, and maintaining by artifice and by will a society deeply absorbed in its own transformation and renewal. Progress means we forget about the past. One that inherently values the new over the ancient, the young over the old, the future over the past. So we need to understand that in our modern world, the modern industrial age, capitalist age, and so on, that we actually have been waging a war on a certain kind of memory, embedded in our bones, in our cells, memory that's oral traditions and oral history has struggled long and hard to be considered a valid form of historical inquiry and research. And these are, what I am saying, I'll take a breath for a second, what I'm saying is that we need to return, in some respects, to richer, more organic forms of memory. Okay? So that takes me back to praise song and ritual. All right? This comes from a paper that I co-wrote with a number of people. It hasn't been published yet, but it's called Responsibility as Ritual. And here in that paper we say, from our as yet impressed chapter, rituals are rooted in the human psyche. One of their main tasks is to sustain human and the more than human community over time. Rituals, therefore, are responsible for innovation as much as continuity. This last point may seem odd. Rituals are responsible for innovation over continuity. It may seem odd, but rituals evolve, like all human practices, conversing with the world. So, in a sense, it's a reiteration of what's gone before. And it brings us to the tools and to the photograph that I took this morning, where I went off, not walking really, see, I had to go out, we got up before 4 and we're in the car a bit after 4 to watch the dawn floating of these beautiful balloons down at the University of the Sunshine Coast. These are called sky whales, and it's part of what for me felt very ritualistic, with music and some singing and so on, lots of clapping from the people gathered around the site and so on, which of course I and my family were part of that group. So it's important, I think, that tools for the future senses, walking, actually just being in our bodies, going out and meandering, getting lost, getting found. Of course, there's the futures triangle and the use of timelines, which we'll explore. We can use CLA to plumb the depths of memory and see what metaphors are lurking there. The 4-quadrant model, which I showed you last week, there's the generations game, where we can go back or go forward into the future. 5 or 10 generations past, we had 1,024 ancestors, and same for the future. There's the embodied tool of interplay, which I love working with, and you'll find more of that in the Phenomenologies of Grace book, where I talk about the grace hack, for instance, the way that when we engage the body, a bit like walking, we actually engage different parts of the brain. We've got to move towards futures feeling, not just the thinking. Counterfactuals is a fun one to play with. What if Hitler had won the Second World War, and what would the world be like today? How do we tell stories, and how do we invoke rituals, and so on? So these are all part of, you could say they're wayfinding tools, they're sense-making tools. They're the kind of tools that any futurist would draw upon, particularly the standard tools, triangle, timelines, CLA, 4-quadrant particularly. But when I'm out there doing my stuff, I'm particularly interested in play, story, ritual, and embodied expression. And that's where I think we'll end right now. We've just done over an hour, and we can, in the next week, I will pull on some of these things and see where they take us in terms of informing and applying the futures sense of memory to our futures practice. Hope you could hung in there with me. The last slide, of course, is just a slide of references, quite boring. So, yeah, if you've survived all of that blah from me, I'm impressed, and you deserve a good coffee or a chocolate or a hug from a friend or a walk with a dog, whatever it is that's your particular joy in life. Thanks so much, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.